Good morning. Welcome to Who You Gonna Call? NEMA 911, of course. NEMA 911 is NEMA's free, confidential, rapid response service connecting helpful NEMA colleagues with our NEMA members on an informal colleague-to-colleague basis. I'm Wendy Lull, President, Emeritus Eco Science Center. I'm the moderator today, and I'm going to start with just a little bit about what NEMA 911 is, what it isn't, how it works, and then I'm going to turn it over to our panel of NEMA 911 experts for the real fun to begin. I would like to start with the land statement for this session. We realize that virtual spaces cannot replace the lands that inspire and empower us. And we honor the traditions of the peoples indigenous to the lands where our NEMA 911 team live and work. They are the Pennacook, the Abenaki, the Wabanaki Confederacy, the Pawtucket, the Massachusetts, and the Wampanoag. NEMA 911 started as a series of conversations between our fearless leader, Dan Yeager, and a group of us retired or senior museum folks who wanted to find a way to put our expertise to work for NEMA and in the field. When I say senior, and I'm looking at NEMA now, I don't mean that we're old, but combined, we have over 150 years of working in museums. To put that museum experience to work for people who might find themselves alone in a crisis, or who are up between a rock and a hard place, like if your boss or your board is part of the problem. Maybe you've been given an assignment that's way outside of your expertise, or that just doesn't feel right. Sometimes it's just a sanity check. Now, anonymity for the individual and the institution is of paramount importance for the NEMA 911 process. And although it was initially envisioned as something that would be of greatest value to people more senior in their careers, as you'll see in one of the segments that we have today, NEMA 911 has value for all NEMA members. So here's what it isn't. We are not lawyers, we don't give legal advice, nor are we a free consultancy. I'm very sorry, but we are not going to write your strategic plan for you. Nor do we recommend goods or services or products. That's why the NEMA has a marketplace and the online network, and the links for those are in the chat section. All of us are volunteers. None of us use this as a way to obtain any paid work. Most of our interactions are brief, and cases are resolved within a few phone calls. So here's how it works. When you find yourself staring like a deer in the headlights because you have no idea what just happened, or maybe you're banging your fist against the table, stop doing it. Go to the NEMA website, and under Resources Museum Support, you'll see the link to NEMA 911. First thing you do is read the terms and conditions, agree to those, and then you fill out a form that mostly just wants to know what is the issue you're facing. As soon as you hit that submit button, that goes to David Ellis, Charlie Brown up in Vermont, and myself. We review it, and then we find a NEMA 911 expert who is willing and able to take on your case. So far, within 24 hours, you will receive an introductory email that introduces you to your expert so you can get started. When your case is done, then your expert sends to the 911 team a report scrubbed of any identifying information, so we get a sense of what's keeping you all up at night, and the kinds of advice that have been given. Since NEMA 911 was launched in the spring of 2019, we've had over 20 cases. You look through them and you'll see that each one of them has probably one of these three things in common. First is that deer in the headlights sense, just not knowing where to go. Remember, you are not alone, and sometimes just having a confidential, experienced sounding board is all you need. Next, things are rarely as they seem. Very often, the initial issue is not the root cause of the problem. And finally, when you rephrase the question, sometimes you'll find that options and resources become available to you that you didn't know you had. So we are going to take 4 of the cases to discuss in some depth. We're hoping to do them in 15-minute blocks, which will include a really fun chance for all of you to chime in and give your opinion about the case at hand. We stick to our time, and I'm going to be the moderator, and Laura Roberts and I are going to be watching for questions. If we can stick to that 15 minutes, then we'll have time left over for general Q&A. So now I'd like to introduce our panelists in order of case presentation. David Ellis, President Emerita, Museum of Science, Boston. Laura Roberts, Principal, Roberts Consulting. Nina Zannieri, Executive Director of the Paul Revere Memorial Association, and Phelan Fretz, CEO, ECHO, and the Leahy Center for Lake Champlain. And now, Dr. Ellis, our first case, please.
Thank you, Wendy. My case came in the following form. A new ED took a curatorial exhibition action, which she felt was justified and within his prerogative. Several members of the board felt the action exceeded the ED's responsibility, and the situation became contentious. The new ED came largely from experience was largely outside the museum field. Had an interest in museums, took museum courses, some experience as a museum volunteer in a coordinator type position, and a very brief interim ED with a different museum. The museum in question is very small, art-based, with board members deeply involved. And the previous ED was still quite involved. Many active volunteers, including the board chair. As I prepared for the call, several things went through my mind. Obviously, I wanted to learn about the museum. What was the action taken and why? How was the dissatisfaction shown? And backing up, what were the nature of What were the nature of the conversations after the new ED started? Did any of these deal with roles and responsibility of the new ED and of the board? Was there any discussion of process as how it related to when and how the new ED would interact with the board, chair? And very importantly, was there any discussion of the role of the prior ED? Now, in the course of the conversation with the person who initiated the 911 call, it became clear that what seemed like a perfectly logical thing for this new ED to do had struck some board members as way outside her authority. And there was an aspect of institutional history that impinged upon how the board members saw the ED's action. So that is where we started our conversation, and I would like to open here for questions and comments from anyone online or in this call. And I have some questions I might share with you if you don't share some with me, but I hope you will share some with me, and that'll make this much better. So, have any questions come in, Wendy or Laura? I hope.
Well, I'm not seeing any hands raised. We did not ask people to do that, so this is a good chance to raise your hand.
If I could say, it's going to be easier for me if you could put them actually, if you're in the app, to put them in the chat function rather than the session Q&A. I'll check both, but chat is easier for me to see. So you can either raise your hand in,
But just to,
you can either raise your hand in Zoom or you can put the question in chat. David, I have a question.
good.
Is there an age difference between the old ED and the new ED?
Yes, at least 20 years.
I presume the new ED is 20 years younger.
Yes. Absolutely. Let me put out a question just to get people started in thinking, because we're really talking about governance issues broadly. And so if you have a question about governance, I hope you'll speak up. But one of the questions is, how does a new ED establish an understanding of his or her limits when it comes to taking actions? And that's a question that every new ED that I've ever met, and certainly I myself, face. Let's see if that helps, I hope. Well, maybe I'll have to answer my own question.
Okay, so I have a question.
Good.
From
good.
Cynthia Walker, wonders, was this common practice at the museum for the board to be involved in curation and daily operations under the old ED?
As far as I know, the answer is yes, because the older ED and the board chair and others were just about there every day.
Ah, and Sheila wonders, how well was the board functioning before the new ED came?
I have no direct evidence or comment, but I assume reasonably well for the same reason as stated before. It was very close-knit.
Thank you. And was there a curator? And if so, where was he or she?
Curator was the executive director.
Okay. And was the job description sufficient in explaining the position?
I would judge no.
Okay. And Rachel, who speaks from experience, having just retired as the director of a museum, asks, you mentioned that the past ED was still involved. How deeply were they involved? And could this have been part of the issue?
Deeply, and yes.
Do you want to say more about that?
In many small institutions, and this one included, it is a very small group of people that are involved. And as such, they tend to develop a pattern, it would seem, of interacting and not addressing the processes in general. It's just kind of how they work. But let me jump from there, Laura, for a moment. I would suggest that a new ED absolutely should find a way early to discuss with the chair, and perhaps better with the whole board, the nature of their relationship and how they're going to interact. And let me just use an example. When should an ED go to the board for approval? when should an ED go to inform a board, but not expecting approval? And when should an ED just go ahead and do whatever he or she thinks is right, and after the fact, inform the board? Those are things that should be thought about, and perhaps in the interviewing stage, not after the fact. I hope there's some other questions.
One of our participants is saying she's having some PTSD, to which I replied, that's why we have this service.
Exactly. Well, I will add one thing that I think is also important and to mention, and that is how to develop a good working relationship with the prior ED. This is something that I think any new executive director has to address. And it's better to take the initiative, I would argue, than to wait for an issue to come up or for the prior ED to take initiative. This is something that is not just a courtesy. It's important to understand how the institution works and what you as the new ED will be facing.
And one of our participants asks if that wasn't clear during the interview process.
No, to the best of my knowledge.
So you don't know if they just didn't talk about it or if they lied?
I do not know. I guess I should have investigated that further. Any other questions before we pass it on?
You're going to tell us how you resolved it?
I didn't.
Oh, wait, we've got a hand raised from Ken Gleason. And let's see.
Okay, I just, Ken,
Okay,
can you
let me-
talk?
I don't know, I can talk. Can
We
you
can
hear
hear
me?
you.
Great.
Right. This was purely procedural to check out what raising the hand would do. And
Okay.
you've answered it. It lets me verbally say something. So thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
This is very interesting. Glad to be here.
Thanks, Ken. So Rachel, who, as I said, is a recently retired ED, is saying, I think much of that falls on the leaving executive director. Most important to develop a trust relationship with the new executive director, but to stay out of the way while making oneself available. That's very important. And Mark asks, did the board own up to the fact that they were not as forthcoming as they could have been or should have been? And he totally agrees with Rachel.
I do not have full knowledge of whether the board did or did not, whatever the word was, acknowledge. I do have information to the effect that there were, and part of what we talked about in resolving this was to initiate explicit conversations around the issue of authority with the current board, which included the former ED and the board chair, obviously. My understanding is that led to a understanding that has progressed reasonably well. I'd like to respond, though, to this issue of whether it's the responsibility of the prior ED. I think it is, but not only there. I think it's the responsibility of the new ED to be sure it happens as well. It's one of these things where it's the responsibilities on both parties, and you shouldn't assume, it seems to me, that it's just one party in the conversation as responsible.
And David, I'm just curious if, and the rest of our panelists or even audience can chime in on this, about how common it is to have an outgoing ED be put on a board.
I've seen it quite a lot of times. The board doesn't want to lose that person's expertise. And the more important question to my mind, Wendy, is does the board chair understand his or her role in making certain that the prior ED doesn't go cross the line, particularly the line of getting into management decisions, but also into excessively trying to influence the board? I mean, I've served as a prior board member on a lot of boards, and I can only say the best thing to do is keep your mouth shut.
I remember Linda Sweet telling me the story that she had done a state historical society that will remain nameless had hired a new executive director. The old executive director continued to show up every day to his desk in the library to finish his work on the research projects that he hadn't had a chance to do while he was director, and to basically snipe from the sidelines. So the new executive director failed. And when Linda was called to do the search, she made a condition of the search that the board pay for the old executive director to go on a very long trip for the first month of the new executive director's tenure. And they said, no other search firm has made that request of us. And she said, and no other search firm understands the problem the way I do.
Well, Laura, when I went to the museum, when I was being interviewed at the Museum of Science in 1990 or 89, I was told that they were going to be building an office for Brad Washburn in his home. I arrived on the scene some months later to learn that Brad had insisted that he stay in the museum. And there were quite a number of times when Brad would go to people he had worked with for 30 or 40 years and ask them to do something, and it would put them in the staff member in a real bind.
Right. So Laura Urbanelli, who has also recently left her job as an executive director, comments, it may be harder if the board president is also a bit of a line crosser.
Amen.
And was that the case in your case, David? Was the board
Yes.
president a line crosser?
Yes. Now, I mentioned something in the comment here. Where was it? There was the action taken and the history of the museum. And that link was one that was not clear, had not been made clear to the new ED. So there was some complexity in this, which I think would disclose too much for me to go into, but it comes back to saying you need to discuss stuff ahead of time, not after the problem is upon you.
Well, thank you. That gets us to our 15 minutes. Thank you very
Well,
much.
thank everybody.
And Laura, you are up.
Okay, so this is also a call from a new executive director. And I'm going to just tell you up front that I have adjusted the genders in this story, and you'll have to trust me that gender was not an issue. When I read it, first time I went through it, I was like, yeah, gender's not a factor in this narrative. So the call came from the new director of a small museum, and the caller was the museum's first director, but it was not his first director job. He was in fact an experienced and generally confident leader, and it's somebody that I knew and had known for a while. And he was looking for some advice about running his weekly staff meetings. There were 2 staff in addition to the director. And I should say this call came in 2019. This was a pre-COVID call when the museum, which had been growing in a sort of steady, reasonable way, was financially stable. And salaries were actually pretty generous, particularly for the rural area that the museum was in. And everybody's employment was secure. Nobody was in danger of losing their job. And I have no idea how they're doing now, but I suspect that they're doing pretty well right now. This was a pretty stable, I want to stress it's a stable organization. So the director said that things were fine at first, but as he became more comfortable in the role and started to make changes, there was pushback. he described the atmosphere as actually at this point getting to the point of hostile. And he called after a particularly nasty staff meeting, which had broken down over something that he considered trivial. So let me tell you about the other two staff. The curator had seen his role expand over the years from just working in the collection to a more expansive set of responsibilities, including creating exhibits. But the director felt that this was too much for one person to be responsible for, and they had the resources to hire out some of that work, although they didn't have the resources to hire a fourth staff member. And so he had proposed that the curator would go back to focusing on collections management, which really was his strength, with guest curators hired in to do the exhibitions. The second staff member was responsible for all of the administrative tasks, office management, membership, marketing, everything that did not involve content. And he was pretty overqualified for the job, but appreciated working at the museum because it was not a very tough job for him to do, and it allowed him to pursue his great passion, which was not museum work. I'm not going to tell you what it was, but it was not museum work. And it gave him some security and flexibility. He wasn't as unhappy as the curator, but he did observe that before the new director was hired, quote, "No one paid attention to what I did, so I did what I wanted, and now it's different," close quote. So after this disastrous staff meeting, the director sat down with each of them one-on-one and discussed how to move forward. He did do that, but he was really worried. The tensions were high, and he came to dread staff meetings. And so the call was actually, do you have any hints on how to run better staff meetings? So that's the lead up, and wondering what questions you all might have. What, if you had gotten the call, what would you have thought about? And as with David, if my panelists have questions to start with while the participants warm up, that would be helpful.
Well, I have one, Laura. I would like to know, what was the first hint that made you think that maybe the problem was not in just the staff meetings?
Well, I think that staff meetings, when he said that the atmosphere was hostile, right? I don't think that that what happens in 1 hour or 2 hours once a week is significantly different than what happens the other 38 hours of the week. And when someone uses a word like hostile, you know that it's spilling over. So Sarah has asked, what kind of topics were covered at staff meetings, and how did the staff communicate between the meetings? Which is a great question. And it turns out that the curator had a lot to say in the meetings, because the meetings were mainly about stuff that the curator and the director had to work on together, whereas the administrator had said very, very little. The meetings didn't generally cover his work, and so he just sat there. So it was kind of an imbalance already in the meeting structure. And how did they communicate between meetings? I think that they mainly communicated, it varied, but as Wendy said, even between staff meetings, communication had started to get pretty tense. And Carla, thank you. Was the board aware of any of this? I asked if the board was being supportive, because after all, both of these people had worked in this situation without an executive director. So they worked very closely with the board before this new person came in. And he said that the board was being extremely supportive of him. He hadn't taken any of this to the board. He had tried to keep it within the staff, but in general, he definitely felt as if the board had his back. Was the staff meeting hostility directed at coworkers or at the ED? Oh, it was all at the ED. The two of them were getting along fine. This was all 2 against 1. And did the ED review job descriptions with the staff when he first started in that role? Job descriptions are definitely an issue, Linda. And he he was changing the job descriptions, and I think that was the issue, was that he felt that the job descriptions, whether written or unwritten, had gotten out of whack. At least the curator's job description had gotten out of whack.
Laura, I have a question. You said gender was not an issue, but had either of the two staff members aspired to be the director?
Yes. Great question. Yes, the curator had applied for the job. The curator was already in a position that stretched his qualifications. His prior training was not as a curator. I'm not going to say more because it would violate confidentiality, but had been through had recently gotten some additional education and had been a candidate for the job.
And Laura, I'm also wondering, were there some changes in the situation of the museum, some new direction from the board, or a community change that had sort of landed for the museum, and the executive director was sort of the throughput for that change?
There was a significant change for the better in their economic situation, and so there was a raising of ambition. Which is why they could then afford a new executive director, and the board wanted to do a better job. They wanted to professionalize. And as I say, this was not overreaching. They could do it. They were being very prudent, but the change in financial situation had made that possible. So I got a question from the floor. Just a second, David. Had the executive director broached any of these changes prior to the board meeting, or did he spring them on them? It's a case of how are you going to keep them down on the farm? So it's not just to be clear, it's not a board meeting problem, it's a staff meeting problem. Was there an issue between the curator and the ED prior to the staff meeting? It had been building. It finally boiled over in a particularly tense staff meeting, but it had been getting worse and worse. David?
By way of background, did you get any indication that the board had prepared the staff for the arrival of a new ED and what that would mean?
It's a great question, and I didn't ask it. It's a great question. And I think that if the ED's assessment was that the board had his back, then that having his back absolutely should have been part of it. And, an internal candidate for a job is such a difficult situation. It's such a difficult situation. I will say this is in a rural area. One of the things I asked was whether these two staff members felt trapped. And the answer was, because I know where this place is. And the executive director said, yeah, they probably do feel trapped. There aren't jobs that pay as well anywhere near where they commute from. And particularly for both of them, the curator has a good job. The administrator, has this accommodation that allows him to do what he really loves. And so, yeah, they probably do feel trapped. And so that makes losing the job even harder, right? And my advice always is, when I deal with an organization that's doing a search where there's an internal candidate, is to treat that internal candidate with absolute and complete respect, and to let him or her know that they're not a serious candidate as soon as that becomes clear, to not string them along. And I say that having taken over as executive director in a situation where that wasn't done, and where the senior staff person who had applied for the executive director job twice and wasn't given it twice, was strung along and was a thorn in my side the whole time I was there. It was not at NEMA, by the way. It was at the Boston Center for Adult Education. So John, who was an internal hire, says, as someone who was internally hired to be the director, I can safely say that my staff both fought me for a time, and might still be, because they weren't sure how I'd be as their director. And I think to some extent they felt a little off ease as I'm significantly younger than them, which is an interesting observation. I think all three of these people were more or less in the same age. And certainly the new director was not young. As I say, he had been, I think was his 5th directorship.
Laura, what I find so interesting, of course, is the initial inquiry was about how to run a staff meeting, right? And it became really clear that that was, as any good iceberg, right? It was the tip. And there was much more to deal with and a lot of other issues. And so I think that's one of the big things I think that we all deal with, and trying to help folks think about what the real issue is, right? And you might comment a little further on sort of what I think you have, but just any more details about what you think the real core issue here is.
Absolutely. And I think the real core issue is a question of managing change, and that this director did not understand really how to manage change, really all of the aspects of communication, as somebody said, and dealing with the loss. You know, I went to the session about deaccessioning under the active collections thing, and they had parties to celebrate the stuff before they deaccessioned it. You know, how cool it was that someone gave this to us. Now we're getting rid of it, but how cool it was that someone gave it to us. And we don't take the time to acknowledge and celebrate accomplishments before we eliminate them. And so, you know, probably this curator felt, you think that the exhibits I did were crappy, and that's why you're taking exhibition development away from me, as opposed to the truth, at least in the mind of the new director, which is we have really significant collections management challenges that we've got to pay attention to. And you've been distracted by doing exhibits, and your real strength is doing collections management. That's what you were hired for. That's what you were trained for. So I think that all the aspects of change management were probably underestimated. I'm not going to say they were mishandled. I think they were underestimated because we always underestimate change management.
Yeah.
Always.
I would second that, Laura, and also include in that the role of the board.
Yeah. And one of the things that I suggested, somebody asked about job descriptions. And one of the things I suggested is that he sit down with each of these staff members and look at their job description and say, where are you going to find new and rewarding work? How are we going to structure your job so that you do find challenge and you do find a reason to do more than just come and punch a time clock, because you can't find any other job in this part of the world. And to collaboratively structure their jobs in such a way that it was a win-win, both for the organization and for the employee. I also suggested that they stop having staff meetings, because if in fact it's always just it's two ganging up against one, and then the curator and the director talk and the administrator just sits there and thinks he's wasting his time, why have staff meetings? Or at least only have them about once a month. And I'm not a parent, and so I learned this from Jane Nylander when I worked for her. She said, you know, parents understand that the right thing to do to get your kids to talk to you is to put them in the car so that you're not making eye contact. And so I suggested that they try walking staff meetings. This place is in a beautiful location, and that they just get out and they walk together and not make eye contact and maybe work off some steam, and maybe not be quite so hostile. I also asked him if he understood that you can't be friends with your staff. And he said, yes. My husband taught me that when I took a job, and again, not the NEMA job. And he said, because I was friends with the NEMA staff. And when I went to another situation, he said, you're not prepared to not be friends with your staff. I said, I love my staff. He said, you love your staff when you can treat them like your nieces, the way you did at the NEMA office. That's not going to be the case all the time. And this was clearly an issue for him, that he was not happy that he wasn't liked.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, I should say. I was going to say guys, we don't say that anymore. Next up, we have Nina with her case?
Yes, thank you, Wendy. Mine is the case that is not an executive director. In fact, this issue came from a frontline part-time guide at a historic site that had very high visitation, strong education director. And the guide was raising some concerns about the tour process, development of scripts, how tours were given. On the opposite side of this, the managers, education staff, were working on trying to make the tour more inclusive and more relevant. They had been working on adding some newly discovered content that was important, but might be deemed or appear to visitors to be of a sensitive nature or surprising. And so they were trying to build a new script, and in fact had done that. Now the guides, as portrayed by this single guide who approached us, agreed about the need for more inclusive content, but they felt ill-equipped to deal with negative visitor responses to the new script. So when the new script was rolled out and they were delivering it to visitors, they felt that in fact, they were getting pushback and they didn't know what to do. Management was made aware of this and said, okay, we'll have some training for you. But the training was going to be unpaid, and this guide was concerned that few guides would take advantage of the training. So what went through my mind was, is this a classic case of guides not wanting to change from how they had done a tour for quite some time? I wondered, are the managers perceived to be unaware of what's happening on the ground? And so they seem unhelpful and not very empathetic. I also wondered if the managers might be under pressure to add new topics and that was coming from someplace other than them. And they also felt a little bit at sea. I also wondered how issues about the script were being raised with the various managers. Was it being done in a respectful way or in a helpful way? But I also wondered if there might be something deeper to the issue I raised with Laura's case. Had someone on the guide staff been passed over, or had guides been passed over repeatedly when management positions became available? So that was the sort of question base that I started with after having a more in-depth conversation with the guide. It became clear that there were a number of communication issues that were playing out. And there really was a lot of unhappiness amongst the guide staff about how the new tour script had been developed, how it had been rolled out. And there was really a sense that there was no input from the guides in this process, and they felt very uncomfortable with that. They also felt that some of the topics were tacked on to the script. So they had their original script, and then in the middle, all these new ideas were packed in, and then the rest of the script. And they felt that it was awkward and might, in fact, be creating some of the issues that they were having with visitors, responding poorly to some of the topics. There was also a sense amongst the guides that this training was offered, but no one asked them what kind of training they needed. So that, again, they felt they had had no input into the process. And from the guide perspective, when any of these issues were raised, they felt that their managers were dismissive and were not, really not caring. We're saying, no, this content needs to be delivered. Here's the script, go do it. Hey, we've given you training. So there was really a bad atmosphere in a place that where I, knowing both the guide and some of the managers, I thought, well, this seems like an issue of miscommunication rather than real ill will on either side. So I'm wondering if there's any other questions folks might think might have helped me think through this process with them.
Again, I'm going to suggest that the panelists start while the audience thinks.
Well, then I always like to do what Laura tells me, so I'll start with a question. And that is in a kind of tension between frontline staff who have such, they really know how to deal with the visitors better than their managers might, unless the managers came up through that. So was there any experience in that institution where management had ever asked the frontline staff what they needed, or had frontline staff ever gone to them and say, this is a topic that's giving us trouble, we'd like some help?
And there's Mark from the chat says, why weren't the guides included in the process? And what was the impetus for the new script at that junction? Was there new management at the top, or someone who was trying to make their mark in the organization?
There was new content that had been discovered that really needed to be addressed. So from that standpoint, management was really stepping up and saying, this is something that visitors going to have a little trouble with, but we think it's important for them to know this about our historic site. I think because of the management structure, a few part-time managers, they were just not as connected to the day-to-day as they should have been. And none of the senior managers had ever worked on the floor. They had never been guides. So I think there was the perception, and I don't think it was actually completely accurate, that they didn't know what was happening. I think there was some of that. And I think by offering the training, again, it was a sense that offering the training was the right thing to do, and they just didn't think about asking the guides, what do you need? Because they thought they knew what the guides needed. And that happens. It's not great. It's not what should happen, but it does happen amongst people who are actually trying to do the right thing.
Well, and Tom asks, why aren't they paying for training?
Well, that is a real error. I mean, I think that's absolutely, and the guide was absolutely correct, that if the training was unpaid, people wouldn't go. And her concern was then that if she went to the training, would then end up training her fellow guides, and felt that that was both inappropriate and not fair for her to be asked that. I will say, and maybe I shouldn't say it at this juncture, I believe that she had been passed over for a promotion to management. And so I was trying not to see everything completely through her filter, which was perhaps a little more negative than what was actually going on, although certainly there were some miscues.
And Mark has a question, which try and answer in a confidential way,
Yes.
which was the new information sensitive or racially charged, and was it making visitors uncomfortable? And Michelle asks the other half of that question, which is, did the guides have any personal vendetta against the new script? So what's going on with the script?
Yeah, I think it wasn't a vendetta against the script from a content standpoint. I think the guides felt this information was important. I think the guides felt that because they had had no input into it, they couldn't help to shape the script in a way that would help work with the visitors, or after some visitor responses were not great, to be able to go back and say, hey, maybe if we said it this way, or maybe if we flipped the script and did it a little differently, and instead of making it sound like we've gone from one topic to another. The issue is racially charged, to answer that.
And this is a scripted tour. This is not
It's a scripted tour, and they were not allowed to vary from the script.
And Kate wonders, is there any history of collaborative process for script development, or for looking at the audience's need in the script development?
Again, I think the managers felt they were doing that by bringing in consultants who helped them develop the script, and, without, again, remembering that on contact with visitors, you get a response you don't expect if the people who are crafting the script aren't that familiar. And the guide who brought the NEMA 911 case said that I said, did you offer to help with the script? And she said, well, the manager seemed so dismissive, I didn't want to do that. And I said, well, maybe you should. I said, maybe you should go to one of your managers and say, hey, you know, I've had some thoughts about maybe some changes to the script that might help with the way visitors are responding. And perhaps offer to say, could we sit down and work on this together? Could we talk about this? Could I help you perhaps make some changes to the script? And in effect, that's what happened. So that's what made me think that the managers were less dismissive than they were overworked, like everyone was. You know, they did what they thought were all the right things. It's like you make a meal, you prepare a meal, you have the best cookbook, and you put it on the family table, and everyone says, yuck. And you go, I spent all that time, what's wrong with you? And the people are saying, don't you remember I don't like onions? Don't you remember I didn't like? So, you know, we all set ourselves up for those things sometimes where we're rushed, we know this is important, we want to do it, we get it out there, and we don't take the time. But I do think people who are developing scripts who have not been on the front line, and I also know now at this site, a number of their senior managers are actually going out and giving tours so that they can get a sense of what the feedback is. And that's really important, I think, when you make a change and you have something like this.
Well, and Tom asks, how about some formal visitor evaluation in addition to this very anecdotal feedback loop, perfect or imperfect?
And that's, again, something that the site is now understanding they need to do. I don't think folks thought the script would get the amount of negative response that it did. Visitors who said, I came here to hear about X, and now all I'm hearing about is Y, racially charged issue. And there was more of that than they anticipated.
And we had another question from Mark, who wondered if that, and I think you just answered it, Nina, if that the new script was making visitors feel uncomfortable.
Yes. And I think it may have been the way that it was presented. I also have to say, I'm personally not a fan of totally scripted tours, unless you allow the guides to manage the visitor response. So you can have content that needs to be delivered, but if you have to do the script and stick to it and never vary, if you're watching the responses you're getting and you don't feel you can stop and try to help the visitors over that hump, and you just plow through, that's not great. So I'm personally not a fan of that type of delivery, particularly when you have topics where you may see that your visitors are, you know, backing up from you or wondering or curious or upset. I think it's always good for guides to have an opportunity to try to help the visitor.
Nina, as you know, I think many of our institutions are reacting to community change and community voice. And I'm wondering about, you know, it's not necessarily just a training issue, but was the institution having that kind of conversation that would sort of float all the boats around if it was a racially charged issue, that was in helping to the whole institution to move and embrace and understand what that means? Or were the guides really sort of they were stuck on the end of the arrow there, and so to speak, being sort of thrown to the public without all the other support?
And Laura asks, not this Laura, another Laura asks in a similar vein, were any of these guides people of color?
The answer to that question is no. The answer to Phelan, to your observation, is I think that the institution genuinely wanted to come clean about some things and talk about some topics that were not known about the particular site. I think there was a lot of good intention. They could have not talked about the topic or talked about the topic perhaps in sort of an offhand way. I think they were trying to do it right. I think by reaching out to consultants, they also reached out to a large African-American institution nearby that was helpful in that. I just think that there was not a clear sense of what the visitor response might be. And I will say, and I don't want to say what the site is, but I think it was particularly true at this site, given what it is.
Okay, Phelan, you are up. And Nina, I have some following up questions for you at the end, but I don't want to take away from Phelan's time.
Oh, well, thank you, Wendy. And first of all, Wendy, thanks very much for organizing all this. You, Charlie, and our elder statesman, David, have really helped us all sort of go through this process and help these organizations. And big kudos to Dan Yeager for sort of raising the flag and saying how important this concept was. So, I thought I had a really interesting one, and I really could not have walked through this without a lot of counsel from the fellow NEMA 911 folks. But here is a direct quote from the inquiry that, as Wendy said, you know, they have to fill out this form, and so I'll just read it to you. The impact of COVID-19 on the museum is devastating, and closure is imminent. Need assistance in how to close and reboot. That's directly from what we got from the institution. So of course, yeah, I raised my hand. Thanks very much, gang. So first things that sort of struck me is, you know, is it really COVID-19 or is there something else going on? What does it really mean to close and reboot an organization? That seems extraordinary. Does it have a collection? How extensive is that? What are the community relationships? How does it sit within its community? What are the expectations of community? What is its financial position? And then finally, of course, what's the leadership and board situation? And so when I got on the phone with the executive director, I found out a couple of things which I thought were really interesting. One is that they were actually losing their space. That is true, and it was a combination of financial and other variables that were pushing that. It wasn't necessarily just a COVID-19 precipitated, but a number of variables that were driving the organization to lose its space. They did have limited financial resources, and so the ability of the organization to pivot and maintain, as I think we're all feeling this year with COVID-19, as resources are tight. When you're asked to do something above and beyond. Then there were some very interesting, revealing insights, and trying to keep confidentiality here, of course. It's a relatively small historical museum with a nationally relevant collection. It has a small but an active board. And then it has an extraordinary relationship to community, more than I would have typically guessed from a small historical focused organization in a community. So that all came out of the conversation with the executive director. And then we started to think about where we might go, and some questions started to that I asked, but also would look to other folks to say, what have I missed, or where might other ways we might have looked at this issue? I really wanted to know more about the core assets and the relationship to the community. Are those, I think often in times of great change for organizations, the answers, while the staff may feel that the answers are within, the answers may come from without. And that's a key look. And they had, because it was a nationally relevant collection and because of the extraordinary relationship to community in their programmatic work, there seemed to be big opportunities there, and poked around with the executive director about that. There was also the real question about the organization's focus. They clearly had been sort of making their way with the programmatic push and relationship to the community, but they had this significant collection that was part of the programming, but I think in some ways the collection, they struggled to understand how they were going to continue to really utilize. And now that space was threatened, and of course we all know that collections take space, that became an issue forefront, is where to move that and how to manage that. And then, of course, there's always the financial issues on this, the ability to have rainy day funds, so to speak, or be able to pivot. But those were all sort of questions that we worked through. And as I started to talk a little bit about, and then questions here, but what struck me so very interesting at this institution was when you talked about asset. The asset, I think, was as much about the relationship to the community and their support of community as the physical objects of which they were encumbered to care. And I think it was that, to me, was some of the breakthrough in the conversation, was the realization of that. Because I think ultimately the organization had to make some decisions about where they're going to move to. Does that involve a capital campaign, or is that a lease situation, which is operating funds? And all those questions sort of came to bear. But I think for the executive director, that was one of the big ahas, was just to try to, when you're thinking about launching a capital campaign, we all are hyper aware of that's about relationship to community and what community would be investing in. And I think there was some big open doors there. And so while the cash was short, the relationship might have been their saving grace. Thoughts or comments?
So since it seems to be the plan that panelists raise their hands first, Phelan, when I think about that incredible connection to the community for that institution, the thought of leaving seemed harder, because if you are, even though their collection and their programs were not necessarily place-based, that the relationships were. So how did, as you're talking through with the executive director about having to find a new space, was that director looking to stay within that community, or were they, he or she, open to moving further out?
Yeah, I think the executive director, I think one of the things that we were able to offer is, take a hard look at that asset to community. And I think the executive director really came to the resolution that it was important to stay within earshot of that community, because there were services they were providing and relationships that, quite frankly, when I looked at it, I went, wow, this feels like a pretty strong campaign pitch, quite frankly. But that pitch was, even though the collection was nationally renowned, the real relationships, and I think the ability to raise dollars, whether it's, like I said, for a short-term fix or a longer-term fix, would be hyper-local. David, I think you're muted yet.
Phelan, the question that goes through my mind a little bit is, how well did the institution connect its collection to its community?
Yes, very
in
interesting.
programming or in other ways?
Yeah, and I will be careful here about confidentiality because the collections are collections, right? They're very specific objects. I think I would characterize it as that the collection was what was items in the collection were an excellent example that the institution could hold up. But the actual work with the community was actually in replicating objects in the collection.
Ah.
So it was important. So the collection had this authenticity and very powerful, but the actual collection itself did not have a high use in the programs, but it was rather replication of those objects and the power of those objects and the story making of those objects for the community itself. That was, I think, so very powerful.
Thank you.
So we do have a couple of questions in the chat. One is, it sounds like perhaps going into stasis was necessary in some ways, but huge necessity to seek professional help on maintaining community touch points and communications. Was there an opportunity to reduce and then reallocate expenses, like towards hiring some experts?
I think there was. I would characterize the finances as, I'm just trying to think about what was the, it's the burn rate on that, right? I think they had about 2 years of burn rate, which, sounds like an awful lot, but that would have been sort of, if you went in and rented a space to house the collection, you would probably survive for 2 years. That means that the executive director doesn't get paid and a bunch of other things don't happen. So I think in real life, they probably had under a year if they were going to take some of that resource and redeploy it in a new direction. But clearly that is, I think that's, how do you take this as an opportunity to build new direction?
And Mark asks, did the community rally? I've been holding off on this question because it's kind of a concluding question. So I'm going to hold off on that and first ask, Tom asks, what did they mean by reboot when they wrote?
Tom, that's a very insightful question because I think when I first got on the phone with the executive director, the reboot was, I got to find a place to put the collection, and and basically, I got to keep my public face. So where am I going to do that? And it was very much a very collection based. I need X square feet to solve this issue. But I think as we went through the process, and I know some of my colleagues here helped in thinking about this, that the opportunity around the community relationship, I think, started to emerge as a very significant asset that they should take a hard look at. If that answers, I think that answers the question. Yeah.
And then the sort of ultimate question,
Yeah.
did the community rally on behalf of the institution?
Well, I think, this wasn't that long ago, so I think that story is still being written. I know I have in the last couple of months just circled back and checked in with the executive director, and they do have some momentum. I think the board has really leaned in, which is good to hear, and they also discovered that the original need for to move the entire institution was somewhat mitigated because they were able to find some space for the collection at a very reduced cost, which then allowed them the flexibility with the public side of the institution to reposition that in a different place. So all of those variables started to come together where they were taking care of the collection, making sure that was safe and secure, but then also could then be a little more flexible about how they the site that they elected to be able to be the focus for their community involvement. So I think some flexibility on basically an interim strategy, but I think ultimately they're looking at, I think anyone that has gone through a process where you've been in a situation where you were leasing space, one of your guts is, we need to buy something, so this doesn't happen to us again, right? And I think that often is an institution. Of course, that means capital campaign and everything else. But I think they're making their way.
It would be interesting if, since this case started out talking about a problem due to COVID, that they're able to afford some space now because of COVID and the changes in the way real estate in certain areas has shifted.
That's right. Yeah, if you're looking for commercial space right now, you're in the cat seat, right? So to speak.
Yeah,
So,
I was going to say, this is an observation rather than a question, but in this sort of COVID situation, the stronger an institution's ties to the community, the better they're faring. And I can say, as an institution that has banked on a lot of tourism, we are hurting more in some ways, although ironically in the North End, there was this, the restaurants wanted us to be open and we wanted the restaurants to be open. So our community ties did help, but it's just an observation about the importance of that community connection. It's really so true right now, and true perhaps in ways that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, I think I think we all know that COVID sort of accentuates whatever is, and so in this particular institution, yeah, I think their great asset was that relationship to community, and that was how to turn that into the finances to really maintain what they're doing.
Wendy, Phelan mentioned something that I think is important for others to know, and that is that we do draw upon each other in how we try to be helpful to an organization. And I know that for my part, it's being able to consult with my colleagues here has meant a great deal. And I think it's been helpful to institutions that I've interacted with.
yes, thanks, David. I think Phelan's case wins the prize of getting the most input from the most of the 911 team members, and in interesting and kind of unexpected ways, which is one of the things I like so much about the NEMA process. You've seen some examples in these cases where someone starts out, they have a problem with a staff meeting, and it turns out it's not necessarily staff meeting or exhibits, turns out to be something completely different. We're moving into the general Q&A section. We have about 14 minutes left, and I would like to ask Nina to opine a little bit about something she said that really struck me when I had called to ask her to take on her case. I think it's relevant as we have been to so many sessions this week about how we deal with with race and some other perhaps uncomfortable cultural topics. And what you said, Nina, and I'm sure you remember it because it was so wise in most of what you say, was that in some ways, institutions in New England are hampered from addressing some of these issues because you don't expect them. When you go to, say, a Southern plantation site, people go in knowing that slavery was part of that history. And in New England, we've done a pretty good job of kind of not talking about it. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how that realization impacted the discussion in your case. Well,
I think that because the North versus the South sort of mythology of the good North and the bad South, I think that many visitors are surprised And I think we should be careful not to take their surprise as that they don't want to hear about something. I think we sometimes misjudge that, but I think we should manage their surprise when we're talking to them to try to bring people slowly to topics. I think that it's the small hammer versus the large hammer perhaps as well. I do think it's important to, and that's why I said having a strict script that no one can diverge from is probably not, it's great if you don't want your guides to vamp and say the wrong thing, but it also doesn't allow them the latitude to respond to the visitor where they are. To say, well, perhaps you might think that about the 18th century, but let's, but now we think about this topic differently. In the past they thought of, and so that latitude of a really good trained guide who can navigate visitors' surprise, or in some cases their aggression. Sometimes you do get pushback where someone says, I don't want to hear about that. Tell me about, the red, white, and blue, American exceptionalism. I don't want to hear about that bad stuff. And then you have to have the tools to work with that. Or you have to provide your guides with the tools to manage that.
Wendy, I think that's a really good question for our entire community, because as we take on some of these societal norms and the conversations around those, I think we just need to be, like Nina said, we need to be more explicit about, this is where we're going. This is what we're going to talk about. We know that sometimes that might be a little rough around the edges, but that's, to be a little more explicit about that. I think it's important.
That kind of feeds into a question that Emily has posed, a general question, which is, how can we improve our skills in predicting when a problem's going to occur so that we can try and stop it before it starts?
Well, this isn't a great question. My first answer was crystal ball, but I can tell you from my personal experience, if I regret certain things, it was not nipping things in the bud, especially with the big boogaboo of communications or job expectations. And someone would come to me and say, do you know that so-and-so isn't blah, blah, blah? And I'd be like, yeah. And instead of calling it to the person and saying, come on, let's talk about it, because I would not assume that the person who mentioned this was necessarily right, because there's always another game afoot, but to call someone in and try to have a conversation to get ahead of the rumor mill if possible. Or if not a rumor mill situation, just being very clear and sort of cards on the table that this information has come to me, or I have a sense about this thing. And I think the earlier you can catch it, then it's less likely to become something punitive or where one person is right or wrong. It's something that conversation could help you ease the underlying situation.
And I think sometimes the culture of museums can be overly polite, and sometimes that gets us in some trouble. I would also add to that I think, and a lot of small museums are sort of very entrepreneurial shops, and entrepreneurs are not really known for sort of systems. Those are folks that come along later and clean up all the pieces. But I think there's a real need for us around operating policies, whether it's the board and the expectations on everything from nominations to who does what and what's management's responsibility and what's the CEO's responsibility, and to write some of that down, I think can really help a lot of folks understand the pathway, rather than allowing the culture itself to sort of carry that and bring it to the next generation, but to be able to have a document. And then you have a reference to do that. And I think we could do well by, like we had here, this was a lot of EDs sort of struggling with their leadership in a particular situation. And sometimes those kinds of policies could really help to set some guardrails for how you would proceed.
I also, when I was at NEMA, I was also in graduate school, and I did a paper about setting up an early warning system for issues and problems. And so, for example, and I looked at a couple of things that had blown up and said, if we had been paying closer attention, might we have predicted that this was going to blow up? And so there was a lot of pushback about values education and writing journals from the religious right, that this was an inappropriate thing for schools to be doing. And if we had been reading those articles, we would have realized that how we talk about sensitive topics and what we say was going to come under greater public scrutiny. Was it going to necessarily change what we did? I don't know, but we would have been better prepared. And so I think that sometimes, you know, it's hard to wear our museum hat every day and every minute of every day. But I think if we read, if we think about what the implications are more broadly as we move through the world, then maybe we would be a little less surprised when things happen to us.
I'd like to pick up on that and say that a word I like is transparency. Communication is given a lot of time and attention, but it's too often thought of, I think, as management to people. And I think we need to be far more open and transparent about communication from staff and visitors into the organization and take it more seriously. I think it would contribute to what you're talking about, Laura, but I think it would contribute overall to operations of our institutions and better staff administrative relationships.
I also think that, and this is something that's been, I think, so clear in the last couple of years, but it is human nature to sometimes treat the people that we like a little bit better or with a little more latitude than the people who perhaps we don't like or don't agree with. And that's a real, can be a real mess in an institution because it becomes clear. And it also can color the way staff who are supervisors handle those folks. And, you know, not to sound preachy or anything, but I always stop myself and say, okay, how would I respond to that if it were someone I liked? And then try to say, okay, maybe I should manage this differently than I would because it's a person who I don't like, and I just as soon say to them, you're screwing up again, you know? So I think that there's that piece of it, and maybe it speaks to your point, David, about transparency and communication issues. I also think that most of us know when we're avoiding something, and we all know over the years that the more you avoid it, the worse it gets, and that's just always true, always true.
And Nina, your comment about, you know, the staff people you like a little more, do you hear that what their comments differently? And I'm reminded of a lot of the conversations in the early directors session today, and talking about the shift that directors make if they had, when they're no longer, their internal candidates have been promoted, so they're no longer friends. And that challenge of not being a pal with your coworkers is, I think you just pointed that out. And I used to try really hard not to be seen to be more friendly with some people than others. And I realized from your comment that it wasn't so much that I liked them or not, it's that the people who sort of saw the institution in lines that were more similar to mine were the ones I give more credence to. And that was human, but I probably should have spent a little more time trying to figure out, well, why is it that you're seeing this in such a from such a, like, honestly, like, what? That's not a good response. Go ahead, David. You unmuted yourself, so I thought you had something. We just have a few minutes left, and I did see that Rachel had put up a question for Phelan's case about partnerships that might have been available to that institution.
Yeah, I think that that was an area that we were just beginning to peel back the opportunity. The questioner is absolutely right. There were some partnership availabilities, but it was very interesting because in that moment of sort of extreme stress, I think we all respond with, what do I know and who do I know and where can I go now to help me now with a group of folks that I'm comfortable with? And I think it's always, like I said, when we were going through it, I think the realization, and this was for me as much as I think for anyone, so we have to constantly remind ourselves that on major events like this one, the answers are outside the organization, and therefore those partnerships might, really to push yourself to do that. I think it's really hard to do when you're under that kind of pressure, but nonetheless really important.
Okay, we have about a minute left. As they say, within 30 seconds, please describe the state of the Middle East. Anyone have any other comments?
So someone asked me about change management. I will try and put this article by John Cotter in the resources. And Ann Mason asks, any suggestions for required readings for incoming board members?
Ooh.
Board Source has some materials that are, I think, at least partially on the mark, and it's where I would start.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I don't, Board Source I think is great. I would also be really careful about what you decide to give your board, because every institution is going to have slightly different norms around expectations. And so it's important to really think about what you give them, because does it align with you as ED or senior management philosophy on how this should work, right? Just be careful. But
And I would say because of that, to have a conversation with incoming board members about what their prior board experience has been, and therefore what kind of norms they may be importing. I worked this year with a small organization, and the new president has experience at a very large organization. And she's clearly frustrated at the norms of the small organization where the volunteers roll up their shirt sleeves. And she keeps talking governance, 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 and it's not working.
All right, well, thank you all very much. We've actually gone a minute over, and I want to thank my panelists and all the participants. And remember, who are you going to call? NEMA 911.
911.
Thanks again, Wendy.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thanks, Wendy.
Great job, Wendy.